once again around Parliament and close to the other side, which we haven't covered so much, at the House of Lords side. We're actually right next to the Jewel Tower, it's called here, which is one of the few remaining medieval structures to be around and hints at some of the medieval background of Parliament. What we're going to talk today about is a bit of a mixture of things. It connects a little bit to our previous video about Robert Cecil, but here we'll focus a bit more on his involvement with the Gunpowder plot, as well as talking about the conspirators. Of course, we are on this side of Parliament here because we'll be very close to where the conspirators actually were, where they snuck in their 36 barrels of gunpowder to blow the Scottish king sky high. We're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here. First, let's cover this little tower and its connection to Victoria Tower. This actually nicely illustrates sort of the difference between the neo-Gothic design, the Victorian, of a Victorian building and a medieval building. So the building we are right next to here is from the mid-1300s, so 14th century, and back then it was a private treasury for the king. So it's a place where the king could store extra treasures just in case. And so it would have been very defensible. Along with Parliament here, there would have been a bit more of a similar wall to this one around this part of Parliament. Although all this design, this massive tower that you see, Victoria Tower and all of that, wouldn't have been there. So you can imagine that it was a lot smaller, and the biggest building around Parliament was Westminster Hall, which you'll see later on. But interestingly enough, come around the 1600s, where we're coming closer to the Gunpowder plot and what we'll talk about today, this tower, the Jewel Tower, came to serve more as a records, so a place where records could be stored for Parliament. So parliamentary records were being kept safe here. And it is those records that detail the apprehension of Guy Fawkes on that fateful day when he was caught down in the cellar with his barrels and caught red-handed, as it were. And speaking of records that I mentioned with the Jewel Tower, interestingly enough, those records have been moved to this tower. There's a little bit of connection between these two old towers. This Victorian tower that was being built in the mid-1800s, finished around 1850, of course named after Queen Victoria, is now where all those old parliamentary records are being stored. So that is where you would find the confession of Guy Fawkes and the details of his apprehension to be kept safe in there. Along with lots of other spicy stuff, such as the death warrant of Charles I. Well, that was events that would take place 40 years later than the events we're talking about today. So, just want to catch something here off the cuff before we go behind the House of Lords. It's just nice to have a little, paint the picture a little bit and get a sense of what it would have looked like in Robert Cecil's time, in Guy Fawkes' time, and James I/James VI's time. And all of this here that you see, all of this neo-Gothic design here, would certainly not have been here, because that was built from 1834 to 1852. But there's a funny little feature here, because the Victorians like to honor their medieval past. And you'll notice this design kind of looks like something that could have come out of the Middle Ages. And it is intentionally built to mimic the style of, you can see Henry VII's chapel here, which is part of a much older building from 1215. So in a way, it's the Victorians' way of honoring their medieval past. So they built most parts of Parliament today here to look similar to Westminster Abbey, which is quite cool. But if you just imagine, put in your mind's eye a big eraser, wipe away all of this here, along with Victoria Tower, and the most lavish building you'd have besides Westminster Abbey would be Westminster Hall down there. So that's the big medieval building, the core of Parliament that survived from the 11th century. The first parts of it were being built in the 11th century, and then it was largely finished in the 1300s, same time as the Jewel Tower that we talked about before. So you can imagine sort of a more basic medieval wall encapsulating Parliament in the 1600s. So that was the legacy left behind for our Elizabethan and Stuart reign. And then there would have been a smattering of medieval buildings on the other side. Very easy access to Parliament. You know, you'd have all sorts of people milling in and around the parliamentary area. Merchants, lawyers, tradesmen, craftsmen, all kinds of people would come and go. So it would not be difficult for the conspirators to get their way in, so to say. The difficult part for them would be sneaking in the necessary amounts of gunpowder to make a big statement, let's say. So we've come right to the bank of the Thames here, still on the north side, just about to see Parliament down there, and we are on this side here, just south of Parliament, right behind the House of Lords, because it's around here that Guy Fawkes, Robert Catesby and all the other plotters were smuggling in barrels of gunpowder, supposedly. And they rowed them from across the Thames, come over here, one barrel at a time, storing the barrels apparently in a house leased by Catesby, who you could argue was the main conspirator and the leader behind the gunpowder plot, where they could relatively safely store their gunpowder in a place where people would ask fewer questions, and then sail them across the river and start storing them in an undercroft below the House of Lords. You can also see, so that would have been somewhere around down there, right across from Parliament. Of course, in a time where there were no bridges going across the Thames here, so everything had to be done by boat and by ferry. And it was no different for Guy Fawkes and his lot. Now, Guy Fawkes, he was put in charge of it because he was a specialist on gunpowder and a soldier who had fought in the Spanish Wars to suppress the Dutch rebellion. So he knew his stuff when it came to explosives, and he had the motivation to fight for the Catholic cause. Because yes, many people think it was an anti-establishment act, which you could say it was, because the establishment at the time was beating down on Catholics and being mostly a Protestant government, a government of the Church of England. And just to briefly give a picture of the scene there, Catholics had been hoping that with the new reign of James I, they would finally catch a break. And they did for about a year, until the king faced pressure from his parliament to start clamping down the iron fist on Catholics again. And that made them even more furious than they had been before, which spurred the conspiracy to take foot. But this is basically the area where it was taking place, where slowly, gradually, they were smuggling in barrels of gunpowder. Now, we'll get into a few different theories about that, because some people seem skeptical about the idea that they would have been able to get in so many barrels unnoticed into Parliament, because there was strict rules about having barrels of gunpowder. It's fairly dangerous for the time. But we'll get into that in a bit. Just before we leave, you can see Lambeth Palace down there. So that's one old building that has survived the ages, which is right on the other side. Something we've been around before, where the Archbishop of Canterbury is. But yeah, we'll continue going up here and getting a bit closer to Parliament. So, right around here is where he would have stepped up on shore and hauled up one barrel at a time over a process that would take months, preparing for when the king would attend the House of Lords and open Parliament. Their idea was that once they had deposed the king in this grand fireworks display, they would then pretty much kidnap his daughter and put her up as a puppet monarch, someone young and easy to manipulate, and there begin a Catholic uprising in the country. Because you gotta remember, this time here, the Pope was pretty much encouraging the people to take back control from the king, or the queen as it were, because they saw them as heretical, since they had risen up against the Roman Catholic Church. So there was plenty of motivation behind the conspirators to do it. But one question remains, two questions actually. How did they manage to bring in all these barrels of gunpowder, first of all? And also, how were they discovered just on the morning before they were about to set them off? It all seems a little bit murky, a little bit suspicious how things could turn out exactly this way. And that has given historians and many other people plenty of room to speculate what actually happened during the gunpowder plot. If we start with the barrels of gunpowder, now there would have been strict measures and rules and regulations. You wouldn't have been able to easily just procure a huge barrel of gunpowder and plop it wherever you wanted. There's some argument to be said that Robert Catesby was an influential man and would have been able to secure the funds for it, especially with his co-conspirators. But it would still have been difficult to lug around. One of the main theories is that they got bits of gunpowder, small pouches at a time. So in these days, whenever you traveled out of the country, you could be expected to be attacked by pirates, by brigands, or by soldiers from foreign nations, mercenaries. So it was always good to have a little bit of gunpowder on you, just in case, especially if you sailed out. So with that argument, you could imagine that the conspirators were slowly storing up little bits of gunpowder here and there in small enough amounts that it wouldn't have taken much notice. That's one of the main theories that I held. But another theory is that the only one who could possibly procure so many barrels in a relatively short amount of time would be someone in government. And that has led people to think that the one who warned the king, or at least the one who brought the anonymous letter to the king, warning him of the plot, might have been the very one to have instigated the plot himself. Sort of work in the background and ensure that the plotters could get exactly what they needed at exactly the right time. And of course we're talking about Robert Cecil here, who many speculate may have orchestrated the gunpowder plot himself, so that he could take the credit and have the king be indebted to him even more for saving his life. It might also have been motivated by bringing ire and anger on Catholics. It's always good to have someone to blame for the problems of your country. So people speculate that the Catholics became the great scapegoats of the country, and it was all orchestrated by Robert Cecil. But it's not concluded, and it certainly doesn't show up in the historical documentation that we have. But it is an interesting theory regardless, because it was a letter to the member of parliament called Monteagle, who was a Catholic himself, and had received an anonymous letter from a masked servant, apparently to his own servants, saying that he should stay away from Parliament that day if he valued his life. I'm paraphrasing it a little bit. I might read out the whole quote for you, the letter for you as it was actually written. But he was advised not to go, and he decided to bring the letter to the king, or rather to Robert Cecil, who then brought it to the king. So I'll read you the transcript of the Monteagle letter, as they call it. The letter that was crucial in discovering the plotters and their dastardly scheme. And it's still a mystery who wrote it, but certainly seems to have been a friend of Monteagle. But here goes. It says, "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care for your preservation. Therefore I would advise you, as you tender your life, to devise some excuse to shift your attendance at this parliament. For God and man have concurred to punish the wickedness of this time. And thinks not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety. For though there be no appearance of any stir, yet I say they shall receive a terrible blow this parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This council is not to be condemned, because it may do you good, and can do you no harm, for the dangers is past, as soon as you have burned the letter, and I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." It's very vague and nebulous, but just enough to tell you, stay out of there, it's gonna be dangerous, and burn the letter, please. But of course he didn't burn the letter, he brought it straight to the Privy Council, which is sort of the group of councilmen that worked directly below the king, and Robert Cecil could then hand it on a silver platter to King James, and soon enough they could go down in that dirty undercroft where Guy Fawkes hid with the barrels and apprehend the man. Okay, so yeah, we are concluding here fairly quickly on the whole Gunpowder plot. Who knows what would have happened if it had actually taken place? Would they have succeeded in a Catholic uprising? Could they have used Elizabeth as a puppet and steered the country in a different direction, get back into the fold of the Pope? Who can say? But if they had succeeded, it would certainly have killed the king and most of his council, including Robert Cecil that we talked about previously. So it would definitely have altered the fate of this country here and the path of history. But it does make you think that it was all very conveniently timed and they just saved it in the nick of time. It's only the kind of stuff that you hear in Hollywood stories, which gives some credence to the idea that it might have been an elaborate plot orchestrated by Robert Cecil, rather than being the first real act of terrorism that was almost conducted. Maybe it was an elaborate scheme of the treasurer of the king and his chief councilman to stay in the king's good favor and paint himself as a bit of a hero for history, because he was certainly an unpopular figure in his own time. He was being derided as a crook-backed villain. The king even called him his little beagle, and others called him all kinds of horrible slurs, especially because they weren't happy with his taxation laws and the amount of money he raked in for the crown and himself. So it is conceivable that Robert Cecil might have devised the whole thing to simply make himself more of a hero. But the facts remain that Guy Fawkes was apprehended from here, at least according to the documents, and taken to the Tower of London, where he was questioned thoroughly, and he doggedly kept calling himself by his cover name, John Johnson, refusing to give up the name of his conspirators. But eventually, even a strong will break in the Tower of London, and he had to give them up, and the rest of the conspirators were hunted down. But yes, we can only imagine in alternative history what might have happened if things hadn't turned out that way. The whole like and subscribe spiel. Yeah. So, yeah, if you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe. Please hit that button as hard as you possibly can and follow us for the next video.